Huh? I'm back in Shibuya. Wait, what time is it? Last thing I remember, I was on my way home from the city. Did I not make it or something?
Sup, Rin dude? Fred, wait, I want to try using my Galaxy Brain instead.
Galaxy Brain.
Whoa, I'm back in the
He
booyah.
just-
This is bonkers. Well, was I right?
Close.
I'd almost given up hope that Square Enix would do anything with The World Ends With You. In the 14 years since its release, there's been several cameos, ports, and teasers that all felt like they never amount to anything significant. How wrong I was late last year when not only did Square Enix announce an animated adaptation of The World Ends With You, but they also announced an actual gosh darn sequel, Neo: The World Ends With You. And suffice to say, it's been great going back to that world. Now, before we go any further, it's important to note that you won't need to have played the original game before playing this. Neo is designed to be a standalone sequel, so not having played the original won't hurt your overall experience or comprehension of what's happening. However, there are nods to the original game, and there are returning characters that you'll appreciate knowing who they are. Ultimately, it's up to you, but just note that playing the original game isn't required to appreciate what Square Enix have done here. The story of Neo sees you play as new protagonist Rindo, who, with his pal Tosei, are having a grand old day exploring Shibuya, and all seems pretty good. They're eating lunch, Rindo is cringing at Tosei's habit of making up weird nicknames, and it all looks like it'll be a pretty good day. Except the part where the pals get caught up in a weird and strange series of events, which brings the two friends into the Reaper's game, a 7-day contest in which players need to complete a series of missions in which they're battling for their survival, with the losers getting erased. Unlike the original game, which saw you frequently team up with a different set of partners, you're now working as a 4-person team, battling against other teams in the Reaper's game. This has bigger implications when it comes to combat, but it also gives you more characters to interact with, both friend and foe, giving a sense that Shibuya and the Reaper's game is now a grander stage than it was before, befitting just what the PS4 and Switch can do over the DS. But at the same time, it also leads into the weakest element of the game for me. While the story itself is fine enough and most of the characters are enjoyable to be around, it's the other teams that feel like the weakest element of the plot. Despite the game setting them up as a major part of the Reaper's game, they just never really get the time to shine or really do much to stand out. They're just there to help move the story along and never really feel like a proper competitor to your group. They're just kind of there. This is something made worse when you battle the other teams. While the game sets up that these groups should be radically different from one another, with different clothes, different vibes, etc., fighting them is a different story. They all fight near identically and are damage sponges, leading to some of the least enjoyable and tedious fights in the game, which is a shame because the arenas you fight in are very colourful and vibrant. Much like the original game, Neo: The World Ends With You is set in Shibuya, and a lot has changed in the 14 years since the game's original release. To put this into some perspective, the game was originally released a handful of weeks after the launch of the original iPhone, which wouldn't launch in Japan until 2008. Social media services like Facebook and Twitter were around, but hadn't quite reached the same level of popularity and scrutiny that they have now. All this to say that the Shibuya of Neo is one that reflects the Shibuya of today, with its editors identified with social media account names, and characters peppering their speech with the occasional meme or two. Some of the writing can be a little much, but it fits the vibe the game is going for. Unlike the original game, Neo features a slew of real buildings and licensed brands, from icons like the Q-Front building at the Scramble Crossing, or the Tower Record Store, or even newer buildings in areas like the Shibuya Hikari or the Parker Shopping Center up in Spain Hill. What helps this version of Shibuya is that the game inherits the original sense of style and makes it work in 3D. It's got a great look to it, with the game making good use of its aesthetic to tell its story and breathe life into the world, making up for any shortcomings it may have on a technical level. Coupling that is a fantastic soundtrack. The original game had a soundtrack that was such a hard act to follow, and while it doesn't quite hit the same highs, Neo's soundtrack is consistently good to great and definitely unique amongst its contemporaries. The game plays as well as you'd expect from an action RPG, but the aforementioned setting is a refreshing sight and helps wonders. It also being set in a real-world location actually has some gameplay implications, with one recurring mechanic being characters challenging you on your knowledge of the area, whether it's simple questions based on observations while playing the game, or others just challenging you on the history of the area. It's neat stuff and a nice touch all around. There's plenty new here which makes the game stand out. One major new mechanic is that you now have a skill tree to unlock perks in, which the game refers to as a social network. When you're not completing missions for the Reaper's game, you're constantly meeting new characters and clearing side quests which net you friendship points, which you then spend on useful perks like being able to automatically sell specific items, or modifying difficulty, or giving you more movement options. It's a great incentive to go out and explore the world and see everything that it has to offer, because you can get some genuinely useful stuff out of it. The other major addition is that your characters now have abilities they can use to solve puzzles and obstacles in the game world, mostly around influencing someone's mind. Now these are neat ideas in theory, but they don't work quite as well in practice, coming across more as mini-games that you're required to do every so often. There's one mini-game which sees you rotating and holding the analog sticks, which isn't all that fun. There's another where you need to imprint an idea onto somebody by combining a pair of words, but you get the words by running around that specific area and then finding two obvious ones that would match. Again, it's a neat idea, it just never quite works all that well. By far the biggest change to the gameplay overall is the battle system, which drops the split battle system of the original game to not only better work in 3D, but to also accommodate the 4 members of your party. However, in keeping with the spirit of the original game, it's not as straightforward as you might think it'd be, and definitely has its own spin on what you'd expect real-time RPG combat to be. Every character can be assigned a pin, which is their attack, and each pin has a button associated with it, be it any of the 4 shoulder buttons or 2 of the face buttons. Every pin has its own input method, whether it's a hold, a rapid press, or a tap, in addition to an element which can be used to do extra damage against certain types of enemies. In battle, you're playing as all 4 characters at once, all sharing a single health bar. It does take a little getting used to, especially depending on your pin setups, because the different inputs and input types present a different tempo to what you normally expect in a 3D action game, but you get used to it eventually. Part of this is due to the fact that your attacks also run on cooldowns, meaning that once you've used up your attack for that button, you need to wait for it to recharge, and by that point, you should be using your 3 other attacks to battle the enemy. The game also rewards you for working in tandem with your party by filling up a group gauge, by whittling down enemies with one character, and then attacking with the others. Once it's maxed out, you can perform a big area of effect attack and temporarily buff your attack strength. It does take a little getting used to this thanks to the pace of combat, but when you can pull it off, it's really useful. Part of the fun of combat is experimenting with pin setups and finding just what works, and not only taking down enemies effectively, but also finding an input combination that flows and feels good. Given there's some 300 plus pins to collect, there's a lot of options you can play with and mess around with to find out what works and what doesn't for you. Helping to make combat and grinding for pins a bit more interesting is some really nice quality of life features. You can queue up battles to fight when you're good and comfortable, which boosts your drop multiplier, something that's further increased by manually dropping your level. Couple that with rarer drops increasing your difficulty, and you've got a game where you can grind at your pace and comfort level. It's really useful, and I'm hoping this becomes more of a standard in other RPGs. Throwing a bit more variety into battles at a dive events, where you dive into a person's psyche and engage in time arena fights with special additions, like, say, enemies being bigger, doing more damage, etc. They're pretty fun, but they're treated as side content and not something you can do regularly, which would have been good to see more of. While combat is generally pretty fun, it can be a bit hard to read at times. Because you're so focused on attacking or watching your cooldowns, there can be so much on screen at any one time, you can kind of feel like you've missed enemies getting ready to attack, or just how close enemies are actually to you. It's chaotic, but not always in a way that's particularly fun or exciting. But at the same time, there's nothing really quite like it out there, and I'm glad it still keeps the original's vibe alive. Neo: The World Ends With You is one of those games I genuinely never expected to actually happen, and I'm glad it has. It's been a delight going back into the Reaper's game and seeing a fantastic recreation of Shibuya, and getting an amazing soundtrack to go with it. It's not without its flaws, and there's plenty of neat ideas that just didn't click with me, but they don't really drag the experience down all that much. It's been a genuine delight returning to this world, and if you've never gotten into the series before, there's no better time to dive in.